All right, so what is the PLO and what role has it played in the Arab-Israeli conflict? So away we go. All right, I'll give you a second. All right, so when we refer to Palestine, what we're referring to is the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So this eastern border of Palestine here and the western border of Jordan is the Jordan River. So the land in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is referred to as Palestine. Now, eventually, most of this will become the state of Israel, but before that, it's referred to as Palestine. So, just to cover kind of the history here and the trace back the ethnic roots of this particular part of the world, for the last 400 years, ending during World War One, this particular territory is under the control of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire we talked about last when we talked about the genocide in Armenia, and we established that most of the Ottoman Empire is Muslim and most of the Ottoman Empire is Arab descent. So that is no different for Palestine here. So this area has been typically inhabited by ethnic Arabs, and they are mostly Muslim. So we'll fast forward to World War One. When World War One ends, Ottoman Empire is on the wrong side of this whole thing, and they are kind of disbanded and dissolved, the Ottoman Empire. And the territories of the Ottoman Empire are dispersed. Some countries become independent. Some territories come under the control of those on the winning side. So in this particular case, the League of Nations is the group that is established here at the end of World War One, and part of their job is to figure out what to do with the territory that used to be the Ottoman Empire. Long story short, this particular tract of land known as Palestine is going to come under the control of Britain through a mandate. So they call it the Mandate of Palestine. So that just means ownership of this territory is transferred, at least care. I shouldn't say ownership. Care for this territory is given to Britain. And the idea is that Britain will kind of oversee governance in this area until the people here are ready to establish their own government. So supposedly it's kind of like a temporary caretaker situation. That's supposed to be the idea. So after World War One, Britain is kind of in control of this territory known as Palestine. All right, I'll give you a second. All right, so World War II. World War II ends, and this is when the UN hatches this idea of the state of Israel, right? And mostly the US. So basically, what's going to happen here is that the UN designs a plan to partition Palestine into a couple different things, the state of Israel and Palestine. So it's going to be two new things. Now, from this point on, when we refer to Palestine, we are not referring to this whole entire territory. We are referring to really three kind of separate, disconnected areas that make up Palestine. So, first being the West Bank here, this big territory. If you look at the map on the right, the West Bank here, and it's called the West Bank because it is on the west bank of the Jordan River. That's why it's called the West Bank. So, West Bank. And then you have this territory here called the Gaza Strip or Gaza. And then you have this territory up here called Golan Heights. Now, all three of these territories make up the I guess you want to call it the country of Palestine. Okay, so now we will refer to Israel and we will refer to Palestine. Israel is this territory that is shaded in this kind of bright orange, and Palestine are these beige areas, three disconnected areas. So this is their plan. So the idea is there is Israel and there is Palestine, and then what do you do with Jerusalem? Because that's really what they're all going to be fighting over. So they decide that Jerusalem will kind of belong to neither Israel nor Palestine, and it will be kind of an international territory with special status, whatever that means. I think of it kind of as the Vatican City. Now, Vatican City, it's located within Rome, but it is technically not part of Italy and is not governed by the Italian government. It's kind of its own autonomous territory. So that's the idea behind Jerusalem. Now, this is how the plan is laid out here, but we're going to have some issues. Okay, so if you look at the map on the bottom, it kind of goes through what this distribution of land looks like over time. Okay, so in the beginning, 1946, it is really just Palestine, right? And then UN hatches their plan to partition this area into Palestine and Israel. So you can see Israel and Palestine, you see the shaded areas. And then you get into the era of those conflicts, right? The Suez, Yom Kippur, 6-Day War. And throughout the course of time, you can see that the territory of Palestine is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, okay, until it's left in this kind of condition. And this is just, a slow erosion over time. It's Israel and Israeli people kind of establishing settlements inside of Palestine so that even though, it's supposed to be Palestinian and this area is supposed to be dedicated to kind of ethnically Arab Muslims, there's Jewish settlements and Israeli settlements that are kind of developing in those particular areas. So, the original plan is not exactly being adhered to. All right, I'll give you a minute here. Last slide. All right. So in response to this kind of shrinking of Palestine over time, in 1964, you get what's called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it's led by this guy, Yasser Arafat. So the goal here is to establish a formal, internationally recognized state of Palestine. So until this point, Palestine is not recognized as an official autonomous country with its own government. So that's kind of a problem. So Arafat's group wants Palestine to be officially recognized by the international community as an autonomous state with its own government. So basically, the PLO claims that the state of Israel is illegitimate and that this land rightfully belongs to Palestinian Arabs and that it was taken from them kind of illegally and given to Israel. So that's, part of the argument here. So the relationship between Palestine and Israel has been pretty ugly over the course of history. Both sides have resorted to violence at different times for different reasons. There will be certain incidents and certain things that kind of kick off waves of violence and tension between them, and then it'll die down periodically, and then it'll kick back up for a variety of reasons, and then it'll die down, and it's kind of this ebb and flow over time. In the beginning, the PLO is an interesting organization because it is really kind of two different things. It has in the past undertaken what some would describe as acts of terrorism. And it is identified by certain governments around the world as a terrorist organization. On the flip side, there's also a diplomatic kind of international kind of feel to the PLO also, where it almost feels like a legitimate diplomatic organization also. So it's really these two things at the same time. So the PLO is going to go through, a long process and a long march toward gaining Palestinian, identity and official government and recognition on an international level. And it's going to happen to a certain extent. So in 2006, you will have democratic elections in Palestine. And eventually they will, a group called Hamas will win a majority of the legislative seats in Palestine. Hamas, um, it can be argued, is far more militant and um, violent than the PLO ever was. So it's interesting that the people of Palestine are electing for this kind of leadership. So that should be noted there. Now, in the next coming lessons, we will talk about what the peace process has been like, and kind of how the tensions between Israel and Palestine have been kind of mitigated over time. But that's a story for another day. So suffice it to say, in 2006, Palestine is in a position to kind of govern itself to some certain extent, and they elect Hamas to office, and Hamas kind of is overseeing the government of Palestine, and no longer is the PLO. So just should be noted there.